Welcome to the Read It Rant podcast, where we don't sugarcoat anything. The opinions are always my own, and sometimes you don't have to finish a book before you realize you have a whole lot to talk about. Tonight's segment is Rant in Progress. This is the first edition of it. This is the place where the book isn't finished yet, the ranting is not final, but I definitely have some things to say after reading half the book already. Tonight we're going back to Lightlark. That's what we're going to rant about tonight by Alex Aster, because after an opening that threw lore, rulers, curses, magical objects, an entire fantasy hierarchy at breakneck speed, I have one question. Is this world ever going to make sense? Like, when I first opened it, okay, she slipped on a balcony, not to mention somebody magically caught her, and then the next paragraph, we're talking about curses and her best friends, and the contextualization doesn't pick up on who picked her up and put her back in the bathroom like a page or two over, okay? And then that led me to my thought, what exactly am I reading, and when is somebody going to explain any of this to me? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Not whether Lightlark is ultimately a good book or a bad book, not what my final rating would be, and not whether I'm going to recommend it. This is a rant in progress, so pull up a chair, grab that bookmark, and embrace the rant, all right? And I would like to say, my biggest problem with the beginning of Lightlark wasn't necessarily ideas that Alex Aster was introducing. Actually, they were kind of fascinating, and they kind of hooked me a little bit. My problem was, like, the speed at which they were introduced, especially within the opening, you know, the opening chapters. Like, I'm getting rulers, realms, curses, magical abilities, magical objects, characters, political relationships, the centennial, and terminology for different groups within this world. And I'm sitting there thinking, can I learn what one thing is before we introduce, like, 50 more? Especially with names and characters, and, like, fantasy obviously requires world building and character development, ma'am, like Miss Aster. Like, holy cow. Like, I primarily read fantasy. I expect terminology I don't recognize. I expect kingdoms, complex magic systems, you know, historical things in this world, especially religions, political structures, creatures and artifacts, and rules. That's part of the fun. But there is a difference between introducing a reader to a complicated world and dropping the reader directly into the middle of that world while expecting them to immediately understand its vocabulary. I can't stand the in media res style of writing in these books, and it's getting annoying and confusing. And it's frustrating because I'm sitting there and I'm having no contextualization, no context clues. And honestly, that was my experience at the beginning of Lightlark. It felt like the book was constantly saying, here's another thing, here's another name, here's another rule. Here's one more group, here's another magical object, here's another curse, another piece of history. And before I even process information, we're moving again. Hold on. Before we even get to that, I got to talk about one more thing, okay, in the beginning of the book. The star stick. That's one of my earliest examples of I was like, what the hell is this? Like, when magical objects appear in a fantasy novel, I want to understand why they matter. You don't necessarily have to hand me an instruction manual. Like, mystery is perfectly fine, but give me enough context that when an object appears, I understand its significance to the character or the world, okay? With Lightlark, I felt like magical concept objects and people were entering the story before I had enough footing in the world to appreciate them or completely understand them. And that created a very interesting problem. Instead of thinking, you know, that's cool, I wonder what else this thing can do, or, you know, who's going to use it. I was like, wait, what exactly is happening right now? Like, those are two completely different kinds of reader curiosity. Like, one is intrigue and the other is like, what the hell is happening? That's confusion. And fantasy authors have to walk a very thin line between those two. And then we get into the different groups, the wildlings, the sunlings, the starlings, the moonlings, the nightshades. And suddenly my brain needs a fantasy organizational chart. I started taking notes. And that's why I actually started doing an outline for every one of the books I'm going to be reading on the rant stack. Because, like, holy cow. And I don't dislike having multiple groups within a fantasy world. It's quite the opposite. Like, especially with different cultures, kingdoms, people's rulers, and magical abilities, you know, it can make a fantasy world feel enormous. But introducing terminology isn't the same thing as developing a culture. Like, if you're going to tell me these groups exist, I want to eventually understand who the hell are these people? Like, what distinguishes them beyond their names, and what do they believe? You know, what are their relationships with one another? What historical baggage exists between them? Like, what prejudice exists? What alliances exist? And most importantly, why the hell should I care about the conflicts between them? Like, that's the question I'm carrying forward as I continue reading, because Alex Aster didn't introduce none of that. Because now that Lightlark has introduced all these pieces, I'm waiting to see whether she turns those pieces into an actual living world. And then there's the FMC Isla. She's the ruler of the wildlings. But early in the book, we're also being told things about the wildlings that immediately raise questions in my mind, particularly the reputation surrounding them and cannibalism and the fact that she's handed a human heart to eat. And naturally, my brain goes, wait a minute. Like, if she rules the wildlings, how much of that reputation applies to her? Then we find out, spoilers, that she's not a cannibal. Like, And then in my mind, I'm like, okay, before I learned all this, I'm like, how much is true? How much is mythos? How much is propaganda? How much comes from the curse? And what exactly does the ruler being the rule of these people, what does that mean, Um, those are real interesting questions. That's where actually where Lightlark starts really getting my attention. Because if the book eventually examines the difference between what a society believes about a group and who those people actually are, there's potentially something interesting there. And I'm going to be honest, her writing does hook you in a way because it creates curiosity and mystery and frustration in one weird cocktail. And I was kind of here for it. But again, I kind of need development. Like, don't just give me the label and then, like, expect me to understand. Show me the culture behind the label. And then we arrive at one of the most major concepts that we're thrust into in the second or third page of this book, which is the centennial. Conceptually, I like it, okay? You have these rulers coming together, you have curses hanging out over these different realms, there are motivations beneath motivations, political tensions, secrets, alliances, and potentially betrayals. That is the kind of fantasy setup that normally grabs me immediately and hooks me. The problem is when Hyla arrives in the story and that portal opens, we're introduced to like 50 freaking characters and information, and everything's being thrown at the reader really, really quickly. And once again, I feel like I was trying to catch up with the book rather than traveling alongside it. Like I think that's like a different, like an important correlation. Like I don't need a fantasy author to explain everything immediately to me. In fact, please don't. I don't want 40 pages of exposition before anything happens, but I do need enough like grounding that I can recognize the importance of something when it happens. And I think that's leads me to the biggest question of tonight's rant in progress. When does withholding information stop creating mystery and frustration and start creating confusion and frustration? Because those are not the same thing. Mystery really gives the reader a question of like, I understand what's going on, but I don't know the answer yet. Confusion says I'm not even sure what question I'm supposed to be asking because she just threw all these people and worlds and magic systems and people at me, and I don't know how to process this. A good mystery makes me really desperate for answers. A confusing narrative makes me wonder whether I accidentally skipped 3 chapters or even fucking missed a book, like a prologue or a novella or something. And during those first chapters of Lightlark, I was much closer to the second category. I really didn't feel like the book was breadcrumbing me. Actually, it smacked me upside the head and said, learn it. It didn't even take time to explain itself. I felt like somebody dumped the entire loaf of bread onto the table and told me to figure out where what lobes those crumbs came from because I was confused, man. I was like, what's going on? But then we have pacing. And this is interesting because normally I love a fast-paced book. Like, one of the quickest ways to lose me is spending 150 pages waiting for something to happen. Like, granted, I don't like exposition. I want momentum, conflict. I want the story to move. But Lightlark has really reminded me that there's another side of that argument. A book can move made too quickly. Like, fast pacing doesn't automatically mean good pacing. And like a story does need room to breathe. A character especially needs room to breathe, and the world itself needs room to establish itself. And a magical system needs enough context that the reader understands the consequences when somebody breaks his rules. That's what I'm watching as I continue. I'm really asking myself, does Lightlark eventually settle down with the like the fast pace and just the confusion? And that as the world becomes easier to navigate and the story become a little bit easier to follow? And do these characters begin feeling like people rather than names attached to different realms? And does Isla become somebody that I can emotionally invest myself in? Because ultimately, the lore isn't going to determine whether I finish this book. The FMC Isla probably will. You can have the most elaborate fantasy world ever created, but if I don't care what happens to the protagonist, none of that matters. I really need to understand Isla. I need to understand what she wants and what scares her, and the burden of being a ruler of the wildlings. And I need to see who she becomes when the expectations placed upon her collide with what she actually wants. That's where I'm hoping Lightlark goes, because I already bought all the rest of the books in the series, and I'm hoping they get better. Because, like, underneath all my frustration with the opening, and I'm going to be honest, at the opening, I was like, what the Lightlark fuck did I just read? Like, there is something else that makes me curious, but, like, I'm hoping that it explains itself as the story goes on, because, whoa. She threw a lot of stuff at the reader really quick and expected the reader to understand what she was putting out there. And to be honest, like, it confused the hell out of me, but what really set me off, like, rant style wise, and then why I wanted to embrace the rant, is how she magically slipped out of nowhere and then didn't even address it in the next paragraph. The next paragraph, you're talking about realms and curses and your best friends, and then you don't bother to introduce the reader to what the heck just happened until a page or two later. That is bad editing, my friends. Whoever edited this book developmentally and line edited, you need fired because that was bad. That was a serious error that I found that I have never found in a trad book before. Um, and that was I was like, whoa. um, but altogether, I am still reading it because she does have a weird way of catching you and keeping you interested, even though she confuses the hell out of you. Um, However, like I said before, when I started Lightlark, I'm not gonna lie, my DNF check engine light was going on. Like the DNF check engine light was almost like misfire. Engine's gonna blow up. It's gonna die soon. Your book's gonna like slowly fizzle out soon if you don't fucking get it to a mechanic. Because those opening chapters frustrated me. That was a little bit of car humor there. My car guys got that, or people, car girls. That was kind of a humorous little. Anyway, the amount of information, like at the beginning, coming at me without enough context, made me question whether this is really going to be a fantasy world I wanted to spend hundreds of pages trying to understand. But here's the important part: I haven't DNF'd it yet, because there's a difference between frustrated by a book and being completely uninterested in it. Like Lightlark has frustrated me to the point I was like, "What the Lightlark fuck am I reading?" But it also makes me curious because of how many people and worlds and interesting concepts she throws at you. And sometimes these are the more interesting books to discuss because of the stupid crap the author throws at you. And I'm really waiting for that moment where everything clicks, and I'm kind of hoping it keeps me going and it keeps the momentum. And I'm really hoping there's a moment where I subtly understand why certain information was withheld and why she threw so many people at you. And also, I'm really curious as to see, if the political relationships make sense, if the curses become more than lore, and where the different realms actually feel distinct, and if, like, also if the magic becomes intuitive, and if Isla becomes somebody I can genuinely invest myself in and I can connect with her as a reader emotionally. If that happens, my opinion of this book could change dramatically. But if I continue reading and I'm still constantly trying to figure out basic information about the world and all the people that she just threw at you within the first 20 pages, that DNF meter might start to move again and then might start flashing at me. Um, so here's where my rant in progress currently stands. When I started this book, my primary emotion was confusion and frustration. That's two, but they kind of intermingled. And now my primary emotion is curiosity mixed with caution. I'm really giving the book room to explain itself. I'm giving Alex Aster room to show me whether the overwhelming beginning was intentionally planted. Pieces like it planted pieces that are eventually going to fit together, I hope. Because sometimes a book that initially feels chaotic suddenly reaches a point where everything clicks. And when that happens, you can really look back and say, I understand what she was doing. But sometimes the pieces never click, and this is why this isn't a review. We're still in progress. And there are 5 things I need from this book going forward. I need clearer world building. I don't need an encyclopedia. I just need enough context to understand the significance of what's happening. I need a stronger distinction between the different groups. Like, I need the wildlings to feel different from the sunlings, the nightshades to feel different from the starlings, and I need these cultures' identities beyond their labels. I need that given to me. And then I want clearer magical rules. And I want magical objects and abilities. If they're going to affect the plot, I want to understand enough of the rules that their consequences actually mean something. And I need more character development, like slow down long enough for me to know these damn people, especially Isla. And our last but not least, payoff. This is the biggest one. If you're going to intentionally confuse me early, I'm hoping you're withholding information for later revelations. Eventually, you got to cash that check. Like, I want to take it to the bank and I want it to be cashed. And I want shit to make sense because she confuses you within the first 20 pages. It's very fast paced. So my current burden on Lightlark, I'm going to keep reading. Not because I'm completely sold, I'm not. And not because opening suddenly doesn't bother me. It absolutely does. Like, I literally sat there at my thing. I almost threw the book because when she slipped, and then in the next paragraph, it just went into some tangent. I'm like, what the Lightlark fuck was that? Like, come on, man. That's, oh my, I was sitting there reading it, and I'm like, really? Like, really? However, I am going to continue because underneath the information overload, I can see the framework of a fantasy story that could become extremely entertaining if everything starts coming together. Because, the Centennial does interest me, the curses and the realms interest me, and the relationships between these different rulers interest me. And the FMC interests me enough that I want to know where her story goes, because I think she got some kind of, like, dementia, like, amnesia going on. I don't know, I might be wrong, and perhaps most importantly, I want answers to everything because, it was confusing. So I gotta say, congratulations, Lightlark. You confused the hell out of me enough that I almost wanted to put you down, but you made me curious enough to pick you back up. You sly devil. And right now, that's enough. Okay, you need to chill out. All right. And that's exactly why I created the Rant in Progress for these kind of books, because this book threw me for a loop. And every reaction doesn't have to wait until the final page. Reading is a journey. Sometimes our opinions completely change between page 50 and page 400, and the character we couldn't stand at maybe become our favorite later on in the story, even though in the beginning they're insufferable and weird and don't make any sense. And I also think a world that made absolutely no sense suddenly clicks. It's like one of my favorite parts of fantasy, because that's what, like I said, mystery creates clarity. And I think she's doing that, but she did it in a weird way. And I think a book we thought maybe would be 5 stars may collapse in the final act. It might turn from a 3-star to a 5-star by the end. You never know. And sometimes a book that sits close to the DNF pile, dangerously close, completely turns itself around. I don't know which one Lightlark is going to be yet, and that's the fun of doing this while I'm still reading. So the question isn't, is Lightlark good or bad? We're not there yet. Tonight's question is, can Lightlark turn information overload into meaningful world building? I'm going to keep reading. I'm going to keep watching that DNF meter. And when this book finally shows its hand, we're going to rant about it. This has been Rant in Progress on the Read It and Rant podcast. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and what you're reading, and never be afraid to have an opinion before everybody else tells you what yours should be. All right? Embrace the rant. Read It and Rant is out.